Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report. I am Brady, also known as the War Hamster, and joining me, as he regularly does, my constitutional mentor, Mr. Constitution himself, Doublas V Gibbs.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're getting good feedback on this series. We're going to continue going through Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787.
We did spend a little time last week with Charles Pinckney.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. In fact, actually, I want to start with Pinckney before we move on and jump into today's episode because something interesting happened when we're signing off. Let me just share that.
Okay.
Okay, we were looking at Charles Pinckney.
So are we saying that Charles Pinckney is even more interesting than we thought already?
Well, maybe. So we went through everything like that. He's an interesting guy from South Carolina. And we went through his whole career, and you can watch the last episode to get all that. You look at the bottom of his bio, and the last sentence says, Pinckney was a Freemason and a Solomon's Lodge No. 1 member in Charleston. Now, this is an abject lesson in why you do not trust everything you read on the internet, particularly Wikipedia. You must double-check, preferably with what we call original documents or sources. So, it just so happens that I have, sitting right here, a book called The Masonic Membership of the Founding Fathers. It was given to me by no one other than Doug Gibbs as a going-away present when I left San Diego. It has been an invaluable resource. It's always by my desk.
Very cool, very cool. And I love having the resources in my hand, so that's the reason why I was thinking about it. And I have one of those, of course, myself. But go ahead.
Source documents. So what this thing's done is it lists a few hundred of the Founding Fathers, and this was written by a Freemason in the 1960s, and he researched all of the minutes from the lodges throughout the Eastern Seaboard.
And that's important because if it's written by a Freemason, he's going to want these guys to have been Freemasons. He's going to be looking for those clues. So if it says something to the contrary, it's accuracy. It's not like where there's a narrative and I want to make sure they're not. It's exactly the opposite. His narrative is going to be, I want them to be.
Yeah, anyway, if he's got a bias, it's going to be towards being a Freemason. And so what he did is he breaks all these people down into three groups. One, that there's very good documentation that they were a Mason, and we'll do a whole series of shows on that. Mm-hmm. Second group is there's some documentation, but we can't be sure. And the third is that there's no documentation that they were Freemasons at all.
Right. Well, there's even some where there's documentation that they absolutely weren't. Also, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, Charles Pinckney, they list all his background, which we've already gone through, so I'm going to skip that. But they talk about he's a signer of the Constitution of the United States, important guy. His Masonic history. Charles Pinckney has sometimes been confused with a Freemason of the same name who is mentioned as a provincial Grand Steward in the South Carolina Gazette for December 5th, 1754, which is 3 years before Charles was even born. So, no, that's not him. There's another Charles Pinckney. So we go check because there's another Charles Pinckney at the convention, and that was his relative Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. And he's also an important guy. And again, there is no record of his being a Mason. So, don't believe what you see on Wikipedia. Double check it with your source documents.
Absolutely. One of my favorites, if you don't mind me taking a real quick sidetrack, is George Washington in that book. Everybody just knows that George Washington's Freemason. And there's actually, I think, if I remember properly, he went into a lodge like once or something like that, and he actually had a statement where he said, "No, I'm not, and haven't been." I think what he said was that I haven't stepped in a lodge in 20 years or something like that.
Yeah, Washington's controversial. In this book, they have him in the first category of confirmed Masons. Mm-hmm. But since he's someone who's been probably as well researched as just about any history, what do they say here? Yeah, it's got a whole long list of Washington's Masonic career has been well documented. He received the 3 degrees of Masonry in the Lodge of Fredericksburg, Virginia, now Lodge Number 4. And there's a whole little litany of that, but we can get into this because we're going to talk about Freemasons.
Yeah, point was, by the time of the founding, he just,
yes,
not so much. Let's put it that way.
And more importantly, and this is the point you've made, so I'll turn it over to you. Freemasons at the time of the founding is not exactly what the deep and mysterious occult group that they've grown to be, at least since the 1850s with Alexander Pike.
Right.
And I've always suggested, we see this at Skull and Bones and others, but what better place to hide an insidious secret society than within another secret society where most of the members have no idea what you're up to.
Right.
So it's not guilt by association. There's some absolute great gentlemen in history, especially in the Revolutionary time, that were Masons, and they were great patriots, and there's nothing sinister about it whatsoever.
Right. I actually wrote an article about it, and that article is in the glossary of my Part 1 history book, so as well. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, as Colonel Tanner Watkins and I have been going through secret societies, we're finishing up Skull and Bones, and we're going to have to spend a couple weeks on the Masons. So I'm thinking maybe we should have you on as a guest for that section of it, because you have done a lot of that homework, and we'll get that scheduled.
Yeah. And let me say this real quick. I'm the kind of person, when someone tries to convince me of something, whether I agree with them or not, I want to do the research before I say, oh, really? Yeah. And, I was getting so much Freemason stuff, so I dug in, not just with that book, but others. And, one of the ones that I got was the how Washington, D.C., when it was built, was designed after, all these Freemason, symbols and so on and so forth. And, the edge of this is at the Jefferson Memorial. Well, the Jefferson Memorial had not been erected at that point, for example. So there's now, and I'm not, and I don't want to reduce the seriousness or toss aside the seriousness of the Freemasonry influence on our system. It had gotten so bad with the, infiltration, as you're suggesting, that there was an anti-Masonic party during the mid-1800s that did quite well. It had it was darn near a major party, and people were they were fearing because of what was happening with it. Being a Mason during the time of the Revolutionary period, it was kind of, if you were somebody, you probably were associated one way or another. That's just because the way it was, but there wasn't the sinister edge of it.
They were actively recruiting the more successful people in their community to join the Masonic Lodge, and therefore, you're going to get some notable names. You said something interesting that I need to point out, and it's that the Jefferson Memorial hadn't even been built. Probably has something to do with the fact that Jefferson was still alive, and you don't build a memorial for someone until they die. So. Right.
Yeah, no, it is. I've gone, and I'll have now that you've warned me that I might be on there. I'm gonna pull out all my notes, but
we'll give you a couple weeks notice.
Yeah, but yeah, it is a fascinating topic, and see, that's why, folks, you want to keep tuning into these programs, because once we're finished with Madison's notes, we're going to get into stuff like that. One thing I can say about Warhamster and I is we're both not just historians and constitutionalists, but we're researchers. And I'll be honest with you, Warhamster is a better researcher than I am, I think, on sometimes. I mean, I'm a pretty good researcher. Sometimes some topics. I'll be like, oh, I didn't see that. So this is definitely a channel to be on for if you're really into that kind of stuff. But anyway, let's get the ball rolling.
Yeah, let's talk about, we started talking about source documents, so we are going to go straight to the Avalon Project from Yale University, which has got an incredible online library of source documents.
And what we're going through is Madison's notes. And when I first met Warhamster, and he asked me about, why do I understand a lot of what I understand about the Constitution? And I told him my primary source document, the primary document that I studied, was Madison's notes. That's what really got the ball rolling for me as a constitutionalist.
And it's so important that you start there, because you know what the original intent was, and you're able to trace, because they're making their arguments right here Madison's notes are basically what was being debated, what did they care about. And we're getting into a couple of important topics today. So, with no further ado, we last finished on May 30th, with a couple of plans, one from Virginia, one from South Carolina. The Virginia plan, because they were hosting the delegation, or they invited everybody to come. And that was followed up by Mr. Charles Pinckney, which had a summary about basically the same thing. And what were they proposing? And what you should see.
So they're meeting in Philadelphia, folks. It's 1787, the summer of 1787. So just think about the time of year. They're there, warm, humid, and these gentlemen have come, and some of these gentlemen have come, like Pinckney, all the way from South Carolina. This is not an air flight up the coast. This is a horseback ride that took a while. These gentlemen are there to stay. They want to get it done, and they went in. And I apologize for hijacking for a second. This is important. They went in with a nationalistic frame of mind. They understood that too big a government was a problem. They feared that under the Articles of Confederation, America would be destroyed under that system. And all of them felt that the federal government should be stronger than it was, but because of their national frame of mind, they were even pushing for something stronger than what wound up coming out of the convention. So as we go through this series, I want you to pay attention to the transformation, the slow change from this bigger idea to what we wound up with. Because the brilliance of the founding fathers is that they could also change and learn. Go ahead.
You're going to see that evidence today. We go through a couple of the topics, because one of the things they were concerned about is putting stuff in this new constitution that the states would basically lynch them for, and never, ever, never in a million years would they ratify.
Right. And that's in mind also as they're here. Absolutely.
And I'll say it today. This will be brought up today. You know, one of my biggest points I make when people give really bad constitutional takes, and I go, no, if that were the original intent, the Constitution would never have been ratified. There's a reason these guys met for months in Philadelphia, discussed these things in the ratifying conventions, which are fascinating in their own right, had the Federalist and Anti-Federalist paper debates, and were very, very clear about what they were doing and what they weren't doing. And had you had things like judicial review in there, the Constitution does not get ratified. It barely got ratified as is.
Right.
You know? So that's why we're going through this exercise, to understand original intent. So jumping into May 31st. William Pierce from Georgia takes his seat in the committee, the whole on Mr. Randolph's propositions. That was the Virginia plan. The third resolution, that the national legislature ought to consist of two branches, was agreed to without debate or dissent, except that of Pennsylvania, given probably from complaisance to Dr. Franklin, who is understood to be partial to a single house of legislation. So even Ben Franklin is not getting everything he wants.
And when it be partial to a single house of legislation, remember, Continental Congress and the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress of the Confederation, were both unicameral, single chamber houses, or single chamber Congresses, should I say. But they're looking back in history. British Parliament, 2 houses. Senate, 2 houses. And you've got one that was the people and the other one the aristocracy. But we don't have an aristocracy. We're not wanting an aristocracy. And that was kind of Franklin's attitude was, why do we need a second branch? Or second house, I mean. There's no aristocracy here. We don't want aristocracy. Doesn't that open up the door to aristocracy? Then the ideas that start coming are very fascinating. The pseudo-aristocracy, so to speak. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, going back in here, 1 second. And here we go. So we've got a Mr. Sherman speaking next. Sherman is from
Connecticut.
Roger Sherman.
I love Roger Sherman. Real quick, so that you guys understand his language as he's speaking. This is a dude that has a very strong, gruff voice. He is known in his history of always getting his way because no one wants to F with him. This is a dude that gets his way. He's a strong voice, and this is just the way it is. Now, that said, at the same time, he's I hate to say it, a grand negotiator. Maybe there's a relation between him and somebody else, more current. Maybe, I don't know, but maybe in spirit. But anyway, Roger Sherman is the kind of guy, he sees connections, he knows how to negotiate. And here's the last thing about him. When he says something, you trust him because he's also well-knowledged and thinks things out and doesn't play games with words. He says what he means. You get what you see, but he's a strong figure. He's very charismatic, very strong figure. All right, go ahead.
Mr. Sherman opposed the election by the people, insisting that it ought to be by state legislatures.
Remember, they're afraid of democracy, especially pure democracy. Go ahead.
The people, he said, immediately should have as little to do as may be about the government. They want information and are constantly liable to be misled. Pretty powerful statement right there.
Yeah, kind of reminds me of that Winston Churchill quote I like to use. The best argument against a democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter.
Yeah, but the other thing he's saying here is he wants state legislatures to pick the member of the national legislature. And as we all know now, they would eventually compromise on the Senate being selected by state legislatures and the House by the popular vote, which is a good compromise. Look, how they get there during these debates are interesting. So Sherman is going...
And realize, by the state legislature choosing, that means that the people are still voting, but they're doing it indirectly. So in other words, not a direct vote, not direct democracy, it's indirect democracy. You know, I voted for my representative in the House, and then he picks, one of the, he's a part of the vote for one of the federal representatives, and then maybe my county legislature, I voted for my county legislature members, and then they vote for the member of the state Senate, and then that state Senate member votes for the member of the legislature. That's his thinking. So the people are involved. There is a consent to the governed, but it's an indirect vote. Go ahead.
All right, the next to speak is Mr. Eldridge Gary from Massachusetts, and he's another interesting figure.
Yeah, by the way, the term gerrymandering is named after him. But anyway, go ahead.
So the evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy. Yes. The people do not want virtue, but are the dupes of pretended patriots. In Massachusetts, it had been fully confirmed by experience that they are daily misled into the most baneful measures and opinions by the false reports circulated by designing men, in which no one on the spot can refute. Boy, does that sound familiar.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, they knew what this mass media and these lying politicians would do over time because they lived it. Mm-hmm. One principal evil arises from the want of due provision for those employed in the administration of government. It would seem to be a maxim of democracy to starve the public servants. He mentioned the popular clamor in Massachusetts for the reduction of salaries and the attack made on that of the governor, basically talking about the Shays Rebellion, though secured by the spirit of the Constitution itself. He had
now, at that point, the Constitution he's talking about is the Constitution of Britain, which is not written. It's a overall understanding of the rule of law, the laws of nature, nature's God. Go ahead.
He said, been too Republican heretofore. He was still, however, Republican, but had been taught by experience the danger of leveling spirit.
When he says, however, Republican, he's not talking party. He's talking this idea of having something that's not a democracy. It is some type of hybrid of some other kind.
Yeah, we didn't have a Republican Party. In fact, we didn't have political parties in 1787.
Exactly.
They would come very shortly thereafter and start causing problems right away.
Well, of course, yeah, and you without causing a new conversation, then you start getting your different angles of the political spectrum. And I know you're going to say up and down. I'm going to say the left and right of the time.
Oh, I've got some beautiful graphics about that. Remind me next week to have those ready. No, I got some new graphics that you haven't seen, and it really just this old talking point. But we're really
I tell people today there is no right. It's all on the left. Constitution is dead center. But anyway, continue.
which is just slightly different. We're saying the same thing, just slightly differently. I just draw the graph differently than you. What's interesting is what happens when you get political parties and factions. Instead of getting local representation, like from the state of Connecticut, you get someone who answers to a national party in Washington D.C. Right. So how you? And that's just not representative.
It's a centralization even of that. I mean, anytime you start centralizing anything, my wife used to work for a giant retailer, and the headquarters was in I think in Chicago or New York, one of the two. I think it's in New York, and she's in Southern California, and they're sending these big giant winter coats for sale, and she's like, "Well, why are they sending us these? We're not gonna be able to sell them." And then one day it's like, "Why is it so hot in here?" Well, the heat and the cool of this particular store is controlled by headquarters, and it's freezing out there. It's snowing. This is California. It's 80 degrees outside. We got the heater on, stuff like that. Whenever you have central control over local issues or local understandings, there's going to be a problem. And whether it's government, a political party, or a retail outlet.
And it's what I always say, it's the concentration of power or wealth in any given group is always going to be corrupted eventually. That's why you need to decentralize it.
It becomes about power too, eventually.
Yeah. All right, not to digress too much.
All right, now Mr. Mason here, that's next. This is George Mason. This is the guy who essentially is the father of the Anti-Federalist ultimately. And understand, he's really nervous about a lot of this discussion. Now, he understands the dangers of democracy, but he also fears not having democracy and centralizing the power into some type of aristocracy. And so he is going to, and now he hasn't gotten at this point, he has not gotten his full anti-federalist shoes on yet, but you're starting to see it. And I think that Mr. Mason, George Mason, was one of the main voices that really tempered the national sentiments of the delegates that were in the room. Anyway, continue, please.
Yeah, it's George Mason from Virginia, and truly one of the greatest of the founders. Mm-hmm. Very principled man. He argued strongly for an election of the larger branch by the people. It was to be the grand depository of the democratic principle of the government. It was, so to speak, to be our House of Commons.
Remember, I mentioned the British Parliament earlier. That's what he's thinking about. You've got the House of Commons, the people, and then the House of Lords, which is the aristocracy. And what they do is they balance each other out. Go ahead.
It ought to know and sympathize with every part of the community, and ought therefore to be taken not only from different parts of the whole republic, but also from different districts of the larger members of it, which had in several instances, particularly in Virginia, different interests and views arising from difference of produce, of habits, etc. This is an important point. In Virginia and South Carolina, you're really seeing this because Eastern South Carolina and Western South Carolina had completely different, and same thing with Georgia and Virginia. You had different crops. You had different priorities. You needed slightly different government. And
you even had different terrain. Along the coast of Virginia, you're going to have the fishermen, and you've got the ocean. You go inland, you've got the valleys, you got fields, and then you get into what now today is West Virginia, and you've got the mountainous region. And so even the terrain changes the attitudes and the habits of the different members of the state.
He admitted that we had been too democratic, yes, but was afraid we should incautiously run into the opposite extreme. Not democratic enough.
Yeah, once again, it goes back to my word that my wife thinks I way overuse, but it's important: balance. You don't abandon democracy. You don't want too much democracy. You got to find that place in the middle. Remember earlier I said the Constitution is dead center when it comes to right, left, political spectrum. This is what they were looking for: a proper distribution of power. Go ahead.
We ought to attend to the rights of every class of the people. He had often wondered at the indifference of the superior classes of society to this dictate of humanity and policy. Well said. Considering that however affluent their circumstances or elevated their situations might be, the course of a few years not only might, but certainly would distribute their posterity throughout the lowest classes of society. Meaning if you're rich today, you might not always be. There's a few people in this room.
It was not just that, but also he's recognizing that the wealthy They're going to buy products, which is going to influence positively lower classes, workers, wage earners, and so on and so forth. And B, your wealthy, more affluent tend to be industrious. And if you're industrious, you're going to create product. And if you create product, you're going to need laborers. So the big cycle is the wealthy, if they do well, everybody else does well too, because we are interconnected. Maybe not directly, but we are. Go ahead.
And this is not trickle-down economics, okay? First of all, Thomas Sowell told us a million times, no economist in history has ever used the term trickle-down economics.
Well, yeah. Well, actually, who began using that word was not Reagan either. They said, "Well, it was Reagan's." No, it was his opposition that actually.
They were using it to slam his economic policies.
Yeah, but so no, you're right. And I'm not talking about trickle down economics, but I am indicating that everything's connected.
Healthy economy is very interconnected.
And when way I like to put it is, when the tide rises, it raises all boats. All boats are the willing to be in the harbor. Every
selfish motive, therefore, every family attachment ought to recommend such a system of policy as provides no less carefully for the rights and happiness of the lowest man than of the highest orders of citizens. So very noble thoughts here.
Okay, now we got James Wilson. We talked a little bit about him last week, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, he's a cantankerous, you know what?
Yeah.
Mr. Wilson contended strenuously for drawing the most numerous branch of the legislature immediately from the people, who was for raising the federal pyramid to a considerable altitude. Interesting choice of words. And for that reason, wished to give it as broad a basis as possible. So he's talking about building a pyramid, obviously Masonic imagery. And he wants a broad base as the foundation of the government, and that should be the people, the broadest possible. Where at the very top, we're creating this new executive.
Now, understand, James Wilson is an interesting character. He is a Hamiltonian. He leans in Alexander Hamilton's direction, but he's kind of moderate for a Hamiltonian. And he's got a lot of good points as we read through the notes. I actually, even though he leans in a Hamiltonian manner, James Wilson is actually one of my higher ranking founding fathers in the sense of enjoying watching what he had to say and how he went about things. The other thing about James Wilson, at least I believe so, he's a pretty honest guy, and he didn't care what people thought about what he had to say. He said what he thought was right. Whether or not he was right is not the point, but he believed that he was right, and he was not afraid to say it. Go ahead.
No government could long subsist without the confidence of the people. In a Republican government, this confidence was peculiarly, gotta have a tough time with some words these days, essential.
Especially theirs.
He also thought it wrong to increase the weight of the state legislatures by making them the electors of the national legislature. All interference between the general and local governments should be obviated as much as possible.
This is a good point. This is a very good point. Federal issues, federal government. State issues, state government. Local issues, local government. This is the localism idea. Once again, like I said, Wilson, while he was a Hamiltonian, he was very, very moderate for a Hamiltonian, and he understood the grand scheme of things and the bigger picture, and also checks and balances and the ideas that came out of the Saxon system, the British system, that worked, the good stuff out of it. Go ahead.
We're saying local government should be obviated as much as possible. He does not want the state legislatures interfering in the federal government they're building.
Or vice versa.
Yeah. On examination, it would be found that the opposition of states to federal measures had proceeded much more from the officers of the states than from the people at large. That's an interesting observation. I don't think it necessarily holds up, but that's the kind of leads into what your description of what he's trying to portray.
Mm-hmm.
All right, James Madison then. Madison considered the popular election of one branch of the national legislature as essential to every plan of free government. He observed in some of the states, one branch of the legislature was composed of men already removed from the people by an intervening body of electors. That's how state legislatures were picked. Used to be like one vote per county. Mm-hmm. Reynolds v. Sims. We've done videos on this. that if the first branch of the general legislature should be elected by the state legislatures, the second branch elected by the first the executive, but by the second together, and with the first and other appointments again made for subordinate purposes by the executive. The people would be lost sight of altogether, and the necessary sympathy between them and the rulers and officers too little felt. Long run-on sentence. He's basically just adding in his arguments to how we should elect the different branches of the legislature.
And he's still leaning national right now.
Yeah. He was interesting. It's Madison's notes, and he's using himself in the third person. Advocate. He was an advocate for the policy of refining the popular appointments by successive filtrations, but though it might be pushed too far. Well, thought it might be pushed too far. He wished the expedient to be resorted to only in the appointment of the second branch of the legislature and in the executive and judiciary branches of the government. So what he's saying is we want the Senate to be appointed and also the executive to be appointed and the judiciary to also be appointed. Now,
but we want the first house to have the voice of the people involved some way.
Yes. And of course, we did not get the executive. So Madison did not get his way.
Well, the executive wound up, not that I'm trying to throw a spoiler in here, but the executive wound up being kind of a hybridization of both. People's voice was important, but not direct democracy. They voted for they ultimately would vote for the electors that would vote for the president, but also the legislatures would be voting for the electors. And so that way, the president, in a sense, got appointed with some of the vote from the state legislatures, but still elected through an indirect vote by the people. And so it was a hybridization. It was a way where we can make sure the people are involved, but it's not democracy.
And the arguments for and against that come later, and it's interesting. He thought, too, that the great fabric to be raised would be more stable and durable if it should rest on the solid foundation of the people themselves than if it should stand merely on the pillars of the legislatures. That's an interesting political theory, and
it's once again distributing the power, distributing the vote, distributing how things were done. Because one thing I learned about Madison even early on was he did recognize that if you centralized too many things, it could be dangerous. He did believe in a distribution. Now, he did lean towards a pseudo-aristocracy at the time, early on, but he recognized the importance of a distribution of the vote, a distribution of the power. Go ahead.
Mr. Gary speaks next. He says, I do not like the election by the people. The maxims taken from the British Constitution were often fallacious when applied to our situation, which is extremely different. Experience, he said, had shown that the state legislatures drawn immediately from the people did not always possess their confidence. He had no objection, however, to an election by the people if it were so qualified that men of honor and character might not be unwilling to be joined in the appointments. He seemed to think the people might nominate a certain number out of which the state legislatures should be bound to choose. So that's a kind of a hybrid of an electoral college.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning the people tell you, here are your choices, and then the legislature makes the votes. All right, Mr. Butler is next. This is Pierce Butler from South Carolina, and he's a very interesting figure. So before we go into what he talked about, let's talk about him.
Okay. And he's one of the founding fathers very few people know anything about.
And as we go through this, you'll find that we actually know a fictitious representation of him. Born in 1744, he's an Irish-born American politician, one of the 4 delegates from South Carolina. Was one of the founding fathers, born in the Kingdom of Ireland. He emigrated to the British North American colonies, where he fought in the American Revolutionary War. After the war, he served as a state legislature and was a member of Congress of the Confederation in 1787. He served as a delegate. And he would sign the Constitution and later become a member of the U.S. Senate. As one of the largest slaveholders in the United States, he frequently defended American slavery for both political and personal motives, even though he had private misgivings about the institution, particularly about the Atlantic slave trade.
Now, this is interesting. Let's stop here for a second. we hear a lot from people that the founding fathers are just a bunch of slaveholders who are trying to protect slavery. First of all, most of them were not slaveholders. The ones that were, a significant portion of that group, while they held slaves, did not support the idea of slavery, and they especially, once again, railed against the Atlantic slave trade. And this would pose to be important as we get further into the notes. So understand, while many of them were, Jefferson's a great example. He was a slaveholder, but yet he hated slavery. He thought it was a horrible institution, but he couldn't afford to get rid of his slaves. He had inherited most of his slaves, and he figured, okay, I'm in a situation that I can't get out of economically and other reasons. So he made the best of the situation. He treated his slaves like family. And when he came home, for example, from diplomatic missions to France, the slaves, excited for him to be home, would hoist him up on their shoulders and carry him up to the house, up the hill. And that's no small hill. Butler, I'm not going to give him as much leeway as that, but he was very similar in that regard. He understood it was an economic necessity to have slaves, and in some cases, an economic impossibility to free them. And also, you're in a system right now that was created needing a lot of labor, and that's in place. You can't just suddenly pull the rug out. So they don't like slavery, but they know they can't get rid of it immediately. So what do? You begin the process that will eventually get rid of it. Go ahead.
And that's to curtail the Atlantic slave trade, which would make it into the Constitution.
Right.
He has also introduced the Fugitive Slave Clause into a draft of the Constitution, which gave a federal guarantee to the property rights of slaveholders. We talked about that last week. Butler also supported counting the entire slave population and state totals for congressional apportionment.
This would give the southern states a lot more strength in the House of Representatives.
And as I said, next they already did have a disproportionate power in the U.S. Congress with the 3/5 compromise. And he wants every slave to be counted towards apportionment. And we'll talk about that today. He resigned from a commission in the British Army in 1773 and settled with his wife in South Carolina. 79, Governor John Rutledge asked Butler to help reorganize
the other Rutledge. It's got like three Rutledges. But anyway, go ahead.
And this is the Governor John Rutledge who was not at the Constitutional Conference, right? Okay. Right. Butler assumed the post of the state's adjutant general, a position that carried the rank of brigadier general. He preferred to be addressed as major, his highest combat rank. Meanwhile, the British were shifting their wartime strategy. By 1778, King George and his ministers faced a new military situation in 13 colonies. Their forces in the northern and middle colonies had reached a stalemate with Washington's Continentals, more adequately supplied and better trained after the hard winter at Valley Forge. There was a risk that France would enter the war as a partner of the Americans. The British developed a southern strategy. They believed that the many loyalists in the southern states, with whom the British had active trade through rice, cotton, and tobacco, would rally to the crown if supported by regular troops. They planned a reconquest of the rebellious colonies one at a time, moving north from Georgia. They launched their new strategy by capturing Savannah in December 1778. Here's where it gets fun. Give me 1 second. All right. Butler joined to mobilize South Carolina's militia to resist the British invasion. Later, he helped prepare the state units used in the counterattack, which attempted to drive British forces from Georgia. Butler is the character they modeled Mel Gibson to some degree. Mel Gibson's character in The Patriot is modeled after about 2 or 3 real historical figures. This is Butler starting the militia to resist the Southern English invasion. So, a lot of The Patriot is taken straight from Butler's life. The hastily raised and poorly prepared militia troops could not compete with the well-trained British regulars, and the Patriots' effort to relieve Savannah were defeated. 1780.
They call themselves the Patriots, by the way. That was the term for the American Revolutionary militia members. and regulars. You have the Patriots, you have the Loyalists, which would be the Tories. These were colonists who were loyal to the crown, and then you had the British regulars. Go ahead.
They said over the next 2 years, he developed a counter strategy to defeat the Southern operations, refusing to surrender. Allies in South Carolina and the occupied portions of Georgia and North Carolina organized guerrilla operations against the British.
So in other words, this guy is a military veteran stud.
Yeah.
In the Constitutional Convention.
All right, and we know how this all ends. He ends up uniting with the operations of the Southern Army under Horatio Gates and Nathaniel Greene, and the British eventually were to surrender. British forces repeatedly attempted to capture Butler due to his status as a former British Army officer. Several times he barely avoided capture. Once again, that's Mel Gibson in The Patriot. Throughout the closing phase of the Southern campaign, he personally donated cash and supplies to sustain the American forces and assisted in the administration of prisoner of war facilities. As a politician, he's in and out of the Senate, goes to the Constitutional Convention. Here's an interesting part. Vice President Aaron Burr was Butler's guest at his St. Simon's plantations in September 1804. Burr, at the time, was lying low after shooting Alexander Hamilton in the July 1804 duel. The states of New York and New Jersey each had indicted Burr for murder in the duel's wake. Burr had traveled during August to Butler's plantation under the pseudonym Roswell King. Butler's overseer's name, during Burr's stay in early September, one of the worst hurricanes in history hit the area, etc., etc. And that's pretty much it. I
forgot that about Butler. That's right. He's the guy. Okay, yeah. I know the story, and it reminded me. Very good. Okay.
So he
had no love for Hamilton.
No, and we're not going to do Burr today, but there's some interesting stories about him. He ended up going further west and trying to start his own militia, fight against the Union, etc. Interesting guy.
Burr was a very interesting guy. He didn't like Hamilton. He was not a Hamiltonian, but he was a very moderate Jeffersonian. He was somewhere kind of between the two. But he also had this. He had ideas that the Union was, from an economic standpoint, wasn't doing as well as it ought to, and he even at one point suggested, and I'm saying that for a different day, so I don't run it, but suggested that certain states in the northern part of the United States, secede.
Indeed. And he might have been conspiring with certain British factions, but that's another story for another day.
But he's definitely an interesting fella. I still like the fact that he shot Hamilton, and that's just me.
Mr. Butler thought an election by the people an impracticable mode. On the question for an election of the first branch of the national legislature by the people, they voted. Massachusetts, aye. Connecticut divided. New York City, aye. Jersey was nay. Pennsylvania was aye. Delaware was divided. Virginia was aye. North Carolina was aye. South Carolina was a no. And Georgia was an aye. South Carolina is still very aristocratic.
Right.
The remaining clauses of the fourth resolution relating to the qualifications of the members of the national legislature being proposed, blah blah blah, and entering too much into detail for general propositions.
In other words, he didn't want to write out all of the arguments. But what we're seeing here is there's still a division. They're not sure what to do. And the problem, part of the reason why was because the problem at the moment was still, do we do this or we do that? Do we go heavy on aristocracy or heavy on democracy? Do we go heavy on the more populated states, have a more say, or go back kind of more what the Articles of Confederation had with one legislature and one vote per state? So it was, a battle of two extremes.
All right, they move on to resolution number 5, and that's kind of the big topic, is that the second or senatorial branch of the national legislature ought to be chosen by the first branch out of persons nominated by the state legislatures. So we're getting closer.
See, we're hiding from democracy still at all.
Mr. Spate, who is from, got that right here, North Carolina, Richard Dobbs Spate, contend with a second branch ought to be chosen by the state legislatures and moved an amendment to that effect. Mr. Butler jumps in. He apprehended that the taking so many powers out of the hands of the states as was proposed tended to destroy all that balance and security of interests among the states, which was necessary to preserve, and called on Mr. Randolph, the mover of the propositions, to explain the extent of his ideas and particularly the number of members he meant to assign to the second branch. Okay, the next one says Mr. Rand. This is still talking about Randolph from Virginia.
Remember, Randolph is Jefferson's cousin. And anyway, so Jefferson's mother's maiden name is Randolph. Go ahead.
And he's the one that obviously presented the Virginia plan.
Right.
Observed that he had, at the time of offering his proposition, stated his ideas as far as the nature of general propositions required. The details made no part of the plan and could not, perhaps, with propriety, have been introduced. If he was to give an opinion as to the number of the second branch, he should say that it ought to be much smaller than that of the first. So he's saying, I didn't write out an exact makeup. I figured we'd hash these things out in committee, and that's what he's given his own thoughts. And
right.
Apparently his thoughts are, would end up being part of the majority. So small as to be exempt from the passionate proceedings to which the numberous assemblies are liable. He wants a small group of wise leaders that delegate among themselves and are not subject to the whims of popular, shall we call it, enthusiasm of the day.
Often that happened at the pub. That's beside the point. Go ahead.
He observed that the general object was to provide a cure for all the evils under which the U.S. labored, that in tracing these evils to their origin, every man had found it in the turbulence and follies of democracy. That some check, therefore, was to be sought for against this tendency of our governments, and that a good Senate seemed most likely to answer the purpose. Boy, I tell you, he got that one right, didn't he?
Mm-hmm. Oh, he sure did.
Yeah, and we've seen what ignoring this advice has done. We get people who are saying we live in a democracy.
And what we're seeing here is we're watching these guys debate this out. They're disagreeing. They're not in agreement often. And it's funny because my wife said something to me a week or two ago, and she was right, but it needed some deeper discussion. And she basically said, well, gosh, the more I learned about these founding fathers, they were all very wise, good men. Well, they were, but it wasn't that they were just all wise and together and they wrote this wonderful thing. It was a laborious, debate. There were a lot of differences of opinion. And on top of that, and I kind of joked about it a moment ago about them meeting at the pub, most of these guys drank quite a bit. And maybe good because it loosened their tongue and relaxed their brain enough. Maybe sometimes they're able to get stuff done. But we have to be careful. Our founding fathers, we want to put them on a pedestal, and that's a good thing. They do deserve praise, but let's not put them on too high of a pedestal. And let's remember, they're men. They're human beings who have their own feelings, their own thoughts, their own preferences, their willingness. Some of them are willing to change their mind. Some of them not so much. And you have to remember that as we're going through this, all of those things are in play here. So anyway, continue, please.
All right, next to speak is to be Mr. King, and this is Rufus King from Massachusetts. He reminded the committee that the choice of the second branch as proposed by Mr. Spate, viz. By the state legislatures, would be impracticable unless it was to be very numerous, or the idea of proportion among the states was to be disregarded. According to this idea, there must be 80 to 100 members to entitle Delaware to the choice of one of them. Mr. Spate withdrew his motion. At the time, Mr. Spate's put up there that the senators should also be apportioned by population, and that they're going to have to deal with that. Because remember, one of the major things we're doing in terms of dividing up the legislature, just like we talk about when we talk about repealing the 17th Amendment, just like we talk about overturning Reynolds v. Sims, is you have to protect the large states from the small and the small states from the large. There's got to be a balance. Otherwise, the small states are never ratifying the Constitution.
And Rufus King saying that it's fascinating because in his later political career he would be more Hamiltonian, more leaning towards a stronger centralized government. But like some of these others, he like Butler and a few others, he was a little more moderate on certain things too. He didn't quite lean towards Hamilton or the other way too much. This is a guy who understood the importance of the balance that you just mentioned. But Rufus King, like I said, he has a fascinating political career afterwards and tends to lean in a Hamiltonian manner, though he wasn't extremely that. Go ahead.
Yeah, we'll do a quick little 5-10 minute biohistory on each of one of these guys each episode, okay? Because there are some interesting stories.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I will say this: I do have my preferences. And Sherman and Mason are right there at the near the top. I absolutely love those two guys. So when we get a chance to talk about them,
I definitely have Mason.
Kind of go ahead.
I definitely have Mason in my Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Well, once you get to know Roger Sherman, because Roger Sherman is just I've always been a fan of him. Now remember, he's the guy that brings them a compromise. And once again, I don't want to spoil the ending, but Sherman becomes a very, very important figure when it comes to making sure this all comes together properly. Anyway, continue, please.
Mr. King reminded the committee that the choice of the second branch, we just did that one.
Yeah.
Mr. Wilson opposed both a nomination by the state legislatures and an election by the first branch of the national legislature because the second branch of the latter ought to be independent of both. Interesting thought. He thought both branches of the national legislature ought to be chosen by the people, but was not prepared with a specific proposition. He suggested the mode of choosing the Senate of New York to wit of uniting several election districts for one branch and choosing members of the other branch as a good model.
Now, let's stop right there. The purpose of having a two-branch system, a bicameral Congress, is for the two houses to be different from each other. If they're going to be exactly the same, if they're both going to be democratically voted in, then you don't need the two houses. You just have the unicameral. The idea here is if you're going to have two different houses, they're going to be independent and different from each other so that, it goes to the old saying, two heads are better than one. It doesn't mean the exact same head, right? It's like Brady and I, we think differently. So together we work well. And that's kind of what wound up coming out of this, and Madison and a few of these other people recognize this. Go ahead.
Mr. Madison observed that such a mode would destroy the influence of the smaller states associated with larger ones in the same district, as the latter would choose from within themselves. So he's saying you got to break up the 13 colonies into like 4 or 5 districts and choose from there, and that's just going to swallow up the small states. Although better men might be found in the former. The election of senators in Virginia, where large and small counties were often formed into one district for the purpose, had illustrated this consequences. Local partiality would often prefer a resident within the county or state to a candidate of superior merit residing out of it. Less merit also in a resident would be more known throughout his own state. We're suggesting, once again, it's protecting the small from the large and the large from the small.
Right.
Exactly what he's talking about. Mr. Sherman favored an election of one member by each of the state legislatures.
Now, remember, they're talking about the Senate. Mm-hmm. Remember, also, I told you Roger Sherman was the great compromiser. And if you look at that statement right there, that's exactly what wound up happening.
Well, we ended up getting 2 instead of 1, but it was really close.
No, that's what he's saying. 2. Yeah. An election of one member by each of the state legislatures.
Well, that's
2 members of the Senate, 1 from each house of the legislature at the state level, and that's what wound up happening.
So, because the state senators were usually chosen by each county, whereas the state legislatures were popularly elected by the people.
Right, and so what that would do is ultimately what that would do, and what the goal was here. And I've mentioned this before, is in Federalist 10, Madison said the best way to control the factions is to set them against each other. In democracy, the heavily populated area faction controls everything. So you need to somehow find a way for the rural faction to have a voice as well. If you have state legislatures where the state senate is voted in, basically typically represent the rural areas, and the House of Representatives at the state level tend to be leaning towards the heavily populated areas, but you have some states that are not heavily populated. You're in the end going to wind up with more senators that are rurally minded than city minded. The House of Representatives, National House of Representatives, general government, whichever you want to call it, the federal House of Representatives is going to then be dominated by persons that, because it's democracy, by those who are the big city minded folks. So what it does, it takes the two factions and and equalizes them so that they can then compromise, set the factions against each other, as Madison would say in Federalist 10. Go ahead.
And once again, that just highlights why we dislike the 17th Amendment so much, is it completely got rid of that balance, and now everybody's popularly elected.
Right.
Mr. Pinckney moved to strike the nomination by state legislatures, and on this question, just about everybody voted no.
In other words, everybody felt the state legislature should have a voice. And remember, not because they believed that, but also they have in their mind, the states still have to ratify this thing. If the state legislatures have no voice, it's not getting ratified.
Next one, they take a vote on the question for electing the first branch out of nominations by the state legislatures. And we got one aye, one no, 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 an aye, and no. This one got shot down too. So the clause was disagreed to, and a chasm left in this part of the plan. We haven't solved it yet.
And right now, it's a very deep chasm that's going on. Once again, they're not sure where we know. Hindsight's 2020. We know where they're going to wind up. They don't know this yet. They're working it out. Let's try this. Let's try that. What about that? And they still haven't quite got there yet.
Nope. We'll see a lot more of these no votes before we get there. The 6 resolutions stating the cases in which the national legislature ought to legislate was next taken into discussion. Basically, what are their authorities going to be? On the question whether each branch should originate laws, there was a unanimous affirmative without debate. Interestingly, because that would change. On the question for transferring all the legislative powers of the existing Congress to this assembly, there was also a silent affirmative. On the proposition for giving legislative power in all cases in which the state legislatures were individually incompetent, very interesting way of wording that, would you say?
Oh, yeah.
And here's a good debate here. Mr. Pinckney and Rutledge objected to the vagueness of the term incompetent and stated that they could not well decide how to vote till they should see an exact enumeration of the powers comprehended by this definition. Absolutely love that. Because that's where we got our enumeration doctrine. We need to enumerate exactly what authorities this Congress is going to take.
Right.
It's foundational part of the Constitution right there, that sentence. Mr. Butler.
Yeah, you could say Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution was formed in that one.
Pretty much.
Go ahead.
Mr. Butler repeated his fears that we were running into an extreme in taking away the powers of the states and called on Mr. Randolph for the extent of his meaning.
Stop right there. Notice the word extreme. We're afraid of extremes. We're looking for balance. We don't want democracy. We don't want aristocracy. We don't want too much of this. We don't want not enough of it. Everything is important. We have to take the things that work in history and in governments and take those little bits and put it together, but we don't want to be extreme. We've seen in history that extreme democracies become tyrannies. We've seen that extreme control over by aristocracies become tyrannical, but there are advantages to having both of those components involved in your government system.
Mr. Randolph disclaimed any intention to give indefinite powers to the national legislature. Yeah, they just took it for themselves over 200 years. Never mind. Declaring that he was entirely opposed to such an inroad on the state jurisdictions and that he did not think any considerations whatever could ever change his determination. His opinion was fixed on this point. So no intention to give indefinite powers to the national legislature. They were to be limited. Mr. Madison said,
remember this Jefferson's cousin, a little bit of Jeffersonianism right there. Not that Randolph was as laissez-faire as Jefferson, but Jefferson had his influence on his cousin. Anyway, go ahead.
James Madison then says that he had brought, again referring to himself in the third person, said that he had brought with him to the convention a strong bias in favor of an enumeration and definition of the powers necessary to be exercised by the national legislature. There it is. But it had also brought doubts concerning its practicability. His wishes remained uniterated, I think, but his doubts had become stronger. What his opinion might ultimately be, he could not yet tell.
He's admitting, in other words, I've got my ideas, but I'm willing to waver a little bit. I'm willing to hear all the arguments and change my opinion for the better. He's recognizing he doesn't know it all. Go ahead.
That's exactly what would happen.
Yeah.
But he's really setting up him and his small faction as being, come to us with your arguments and we're going to be the swing vote.
Mm-hmm.
But he should shrink from nothing which should be found essential to such a form of government as would provide for the safety, liberty, and happiness of the community. Again, those three are the whole reasons we're having this meeting in the first place. This being the end of all our deliberations, all the necessary means for attaining it must, however, reluctantly be submitted to. On a question for giving powers in cases to which the states are not competent, Massachusetts aye, Connecticut was divided, New York was aye, New Jersey was aye, Pennsylvania aye, Delaware was aye, Virginia was aye, North Carolina was aye, and South, everyone but Massachusetts.
Now, here's the thing. Connecticut divided. Sherman, no. Ellsworth, aye. Why did Madison believe it so important to put that? Connecticut, he believed, would be one of the states that might swing things. He also recognized Sherman's strength in this delegation. And I think he wanted to point it out. I think he wanted people to know where those two stood.
Sherman's the only no vote in this one.
Yeah.
As long as, of course, we want to define what that word competent means.
And it's funny. Sherman's the only no vote, but yet he's very respected by these delegates. Go ahead.
This next paragraph's really important. And do I have the footnote on it? No, I don't. The other clauses, giving powers necessary to preserve harmony among the states, here's the big part, to negative all state laws contravening in the opinion of the national legislature. The Articles of Union down to the last clause. The words or any treaties subsisting under the authority of the Union being added after the words contravening in Articles of the Union on motion of Dr. Franklin were agreed to without debate or dissent. The last clause of Resolution 6 authorized an exertion of the force of the whole against a delinquent state next came into consideration. There's a lot there. I don't want to break it down today because it's going to be broken down into the individual parts. But the whole key phrase there is: was there a negative on all state laws? And that's a very important issue. Okay, Mr. Madison observed that the more he reflected on the use of force, the more he doubted the practicability, the justice, and the efficacy of it when applied to the people collectively and not individually. Can these new federal government use forces against a delinquent state?
Now, this is interesting here. This is Madison kind of throwing in his conclusion there at the end of the day. Go ahead.
The union of the states containing such an ingredient seems to provide for its own destruction.
We don't want force. We don't want control. We don't want dictates. Go ahead.
The use of force against a state would look more like a declaration of war than an infliction of punishment, and would probably be considered by the party attacked as a dissolution of all previous compacts by which it might be bound.
In other words, this union is not going to hold together if you allow this central government to negative state laws, to have control over the states, to dictate to the states it's not going to hold together as a union. That's what he's saying.
Yeah, and that's going to lead directly to the conversations about standing army, state militias, and all that language that makes it in the Constitution. It starts with a statement by Madison. His concern that a national army or military would be used to bully the states.
But here's the situation. We don't want this national legislature, this central government, federal government, to have power over the states, but at the same time, it needs to be strong. And it needs to be powerful in certain avenues. Because if we don't have any authority centralized and the states just do whatever they want, then you have the Articles of Confederation. So what do? So it's sort of like a situation right now in the news. You don't want a president that is a king or a dictator, but you want him to have the strength to do the things that need to be done that fall within his responsibilities. So, it goes back to what I've used in class. Under the Articles of Confederation, they had a lamb. They were creating a lion, but lions eat people. So what do? You figure out how you can have a ferocious lion that, when unleashed, it could do the job, but it's not so powerful that it devours the sovereignty of the states. So you put it in a cage, the Constitution. You limit it on domestic issues. You give it a little bit more teeth on international, foreign affairs, things like that, but you have a control over it. You find that medium. You have the ferociousness of a authoritarian. You have the limitations of a confederation, and you find that medium somewhere.
Unfortunately, in this case, the lion got let out of its cage and ate all the zookeepers. He hoped.
They're made a hope yet. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, that's why we're working on it. That's why we do this. He hoped that such a system would be framed as might render this recourse, which is force, unnecessary, and moved that the clause be postponed. This motion was agreed to, blah, blah. The committee then rose, and the House adjourned, and they headed off to the pub.
To really hash it out.
So this is a good episode. It's really laying out some of the important arguments and where they came from and why.
Right.
And, we got to know Pierce Butler a little bit, and he is one of the biggest landowners. He ended up being one of the biggest landowners in America. Very, very wealthy man, successful businessman. He's buried in a shrine, some kind of a shrine up in Philadelphia, where he had built a summer home. He liked it here in this summer in 1787 so much. But a very colorful career with some interesting constitutional debate thoughts. You want to add anything further today, or should we shut it down?
No, I think we covered it quite well. I want to remind the viewers that this is a series. I haven't put these on my site, so I'm going to find all the links and get it on there probably today, because we need to get this out to as many people as possible. Once again, much of the foundation of my training as a constitutionalist is Madison's notes. This is where I essentially began. I mean, actually originally began looking up the academic end, and then was taught by a mentor that my view was, well, the academic view, the legal view is wrong. And then he introduced me to Madison's notes. So my retraining really was its foundation was Madison's notes. This is where you begin. This is important. Every American should understand and know this. If we don't understand our Constitution, how can we defend it? So I'm glad we're doing this series. I'm glad you're here. Tell more people, bring more people to this series, because it's important. We as Americans need to know these things. And real quick, I'll plug myself. You can find me at DouglasVGibbs.com.
Very good. Appreciate you being here. We will try to get another one done this week. I've got an interesting schedule. I'll be in touch. And guys, until the next time, everybody, thanks for coming. And you know where to find me because you're watching my channel. And cheers, everybody.